Frank Sinatra stood up so fast that his chair toppled backward onto the Tonight Show stage floor, his voice cutting through the studio with an intensity that made 24 million Americans forget they were watching a comedy program. A physical transformation so complete and so immediate that several people present later said it took them several long seconds to fully register that this was the same effortlessly composed performer whose smooth public persona had defined American entertainment for 2 full decades. It was November 12, 1965, 11:47 p.m., NBC Studios in Burbank, and the man whose smooth, effortless charm had defined an entire generation of American music was now standing directly over another guest, his face carrying an anger that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with a friendship he had spent nearly 2 decades protecting, often quietly, often without any public credit at all. Coming up, exactly what was said that made Frank Sinatra abandon every ounce of his famous cool composure, the real story of what Sinatra had actually done behind the scenes for years before that broadcast to protect his closest friend from a country that frequently refused to treat him as an equal, and what happened when Johnny Carson realized he might be witnessing the most significant unscripted moment in the entire history of his program. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double-check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double-check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night, because what almost nobody watching that broadcast understood was that Frank Sinatra had been fighting this exact battle, largely unnoticed, for nearly 20 years before it finally erupted in front of a national television audience. Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. met in the mid-1940s, when Davis was still a teenager performing with his father and uncle in a family vaudeville act, and Sinatra, already an enormous singing sensation, took an immediate and genuine interest in the young performer's extraordinary talent, a talent that spanned singing, dancing, comedy, and musical impressions with a versatility that Sinatra himself considered genuinely remarkable. This early mentorship developed, across the following 2 decades, into one of the most significant and most genuinely loyal friendships in the history of American entertainment, a friendship that would eventually place both men at the center of the group popularly known as the Rat Pack, alongside Dean Martin and several other prominent performers, a collective that became, by the early 1960s, one of the most commercially successful and most culturally significant entertainment phenomena in the country. The specific circumstances of their earliest interactions deserve fuller understanding, because they illuminate exactly how genuine and how immediate their connection actually was. Sinatra first encountered young Sammy Davis Jr. backstage at a theater where both acts happened to be performing on the same bill, and according to accounts given by people present, Sinatra approached the considerably less established young performer directly, offering specific and genuinely useful career advice about stage presence and vocal technique that Davis credited, throughout his subsequent career, with meaningfully shaping his own developing performance style. This early generosity, extended by an already enormously successful star toward a teenage performer with no established industry connections of his own, established a pattern of genuine mentorship and genuine personal investment that would characterize their entire subsequent relationship, extending considerably beyond ordinary professional courtesy into something that both men, across the following decades, consistently described as genuine brotherhood. What almost nobody in the general American public fully understood watching the glamorous and seemingly effortless success of the Rat Pack's various Las Vegas engagements and film collaborations, was the specific and considerable discrimination that Sammy Davis Jr. faced throughout this entire period. Discrimination that persisted despite his extraordinary talent and his considerable commercial success, a specific and painful reality of segregation-era America that continued operating even within the supposedly glamorous and cosmopolitan entertainment industry. Davis, throughout the 1950s and well into the 1960s, was frequently barred from staying in the same hotels where he performed, required instead to find lodging in considerably less desirable accommodations in segregated sections of Las Vegas and other cities, despite headlining shows that drew enormous and enthusiastic audiences to the very venues that refused to let him sleep under their roofs. The specific daily indignity of this arrangement deserves fuller documentation, because it illuminates exactly what Davis navigated throughout the most successful years of his early career. He would perform to sold-out audiences in the main showroom of a major Las Vegas hotel, receiving standing ovations from crowds that included some of the most influential figures in American entertainment and American business, and then, following his performance, be required to leave the hotel entirely and travel to a considerably less accommodating establishment in a segregated section of the city, simply to have a place to sleep for the night. This specific pattern, repeated across countless individual engagements throughout the 1950s, meant that Davis experienced, on a nightly basis, the particular and painful whiplash of complete professional triumph, followed immediately by a stark and humiliating reminder that his talent and his commercial success had not actually earned him the basic dignity of equal treatment that his white colleagues took entirely for granted. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment, because what happens on that stage in a few minutes reveals a side of Frank Sinatra that almost nobody in America ever fully understood. Frank Sinatra's response to this specific and pervasive discrimination, largely unpublicized at the time and only gradually documented in the decades since, represented a genuine and considerable exercise of his own commercial leverage on behalf of his friend. Sinatra, understanding his own enormous commercial value to the hotels and casinos that depended on his performances to draw audiences, began, according to numerous accounts given by people who witnessed these confrontations directly, explicitly threatening to cancel his own engagements at any venue that refused to allow Davis equal accommodation and equal access to the hotel's facilities. This was not, according to these accounts, an occasional or symbolic gesture. Sinatra confronted hotel management directly and repeatedly across the 1950s and 1960s, insisting, in terms that left no room for negotiation, that Davis be permitted to stay in the same hotels, eat in the same restaurants, and use the same facilities as any other headlining performer, understanding that his own commercial power gave him leverage that few other entertainers of that era possessed or were willing to use on behalf of a colleague facing this specific kind of discrimination. One specific and well-documented incident involved a major Las Vegas hotel that had initially refused Davis accommodation despite his headlining status, prompting Sinatra to inform the hotel's management directly that he would cancel his own considerably lucrative engagement immediately unless the policy was reversed within the hour, a demand the hotel's management ultimately met precisely because Sinatra's own commercial value to the establishment vastly exceeded whatever benefit the hotel believed its discriminatory policy provided. This specific pattern of direct commercial leverage, deployed repeatedly and consistently, rather than as an occasional symbolic gesture, distinguished Sinatra's advocacy from the more limited and more cautious support that many of his contemporaries offered to colleagues facing similar discrimination during this period. The specific and considerable personal cost of this advocacy deserves fuller understanding, because it illuminates exactly how genuine Sinatra's commitment to this cause actually was. This commitment persisted, despite the specific and genuine risk it carried to Sinatra's own considerable business interests throughout an industry where discriminatory practices remained, for much of this period, essentially unquestioned and entirely unregulated by any meaningful external oversight. Several hotel and casino operators, according to accounts given by industry insiders from this period, privately resented Sinatra's insistence on this issue, considering it a genuine business complication in an era when segregationist policies remained the unquestioned norm across much of the American entertainment industry, particularly in Nevada and throughout the American South. Sinatra risked genuine commercial friction with powerful business interests by consistently insisting on this issue, a risk he apparently considered entirely justified given his genuine personal loyalty to Davis and his own evolving and increasingly outspoken beliefs about racial equality more broadly. Several of Sinatra's own business associates, according to accounts given decades later, privately advised him on multiple occasions to moderate his public insistence on this issue, warning him that his consistent advocacy risked genuine damage to his own considerable business relationships throughout the entertainment industry, relationships that depended substantially on maintaining smooth and uncomplicated partnerships with hotel and casino operators who preferred not to have their discriminatory policies publicly challenged. Sinatra, according to these same accounts, consistently rejected this advice, telling at least one associate directly that he considered the specific business relationships being risked considerably less important than his personal loyalty to a friend who had done nothing to deserve the treatment he was consistently receiving, a conviction Sinatra apparently held with genuine and unwavering consistency throughout the entire period of their friendship. Johnny Carson had booked both Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. for the same broadcast for entirely ordinary reasons, a joint appearance built around discussion of their considerable success as part of the Rat Pack's various Las Vegas engagements. Carson himself had genuine personal admiration for both men, having interviewed each of them separately on numerous previous occasions, and he considered this particular joint appearance a genuine opportunity to showcase the specific and celebrated chemistry that had made their partnership, both professional and personal, such a beloved fixture of American entertainment throughout the preceding 2 decades. Also appearing on the broadcast that evening was a third guest, a comedian whose material occasionally drew on the kind of casually accepted racial humor that remained, unfortunately, a persistent feature of American entertainment during this specific period. This particular comedian's material had never previously generated significant controversy on any of his numerous prior television appearances. This comedian had appeared on Carson's program on several previous occasions without incident, and the production team had no specific reason to anticipate that his material that particular evening would depart significantly from the ordinary, if occasionally insensitive, comedic conventions that characterized much of his established repertoire. The broadcast began exactly as anticipated, Sinatra and Davis trading warm and genuinely affectionate stories about their considerable success together, the studio audience delighting in the easy chemistry that had made their partnership, both professional and personal, so genuinely beloved across American popular culture. Neither man nor anyone on the production staff had any indication that the broadcast would depart from this comfortable and thoroughly enjoyable pattern before the evening concluded. The third guest, appearing later in the broadcast for a separate comedic segment, began a routine that included several jokes built on exactly the kind of casually accepted racial stereotyping that Davis had spent his entire career navigating and enduring, material that, according to everyone present, initially produced the same uncomfortable laughter such material frequently generated during this specific period of American cultural history. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. The comedian, apparently encouraged by the studio audience's initial response, continued his routine, escalating toward a specific joke that directly and explicitly targeted Sammy Davis Jr. by name, referencing his race in terms that went considerably beyond the ordinary boundaries even of that era's frequently insensitive comedic conventions. Several people present later described the specific and uncomfortable escalation of this material, the comedian apparently misreading the audience's initial uncertain laughter as encouragement rather than discomfort, a miscalculation that led him to push the material considerably further than he had likely originally intended, transforming what might have remained an ordinary and largely forgettable moment of era-typical insensitivity into something considerably more direct and considerably more genuinely offensive. The studio audience's laughter died almost instantly, several people present later describing a specific and immediate recognition that this particular joke had crossed a line that even the era's considerably more permissive standards did not typically tolerate. The transition from uncomfortable laughter to complete and total silence occurred within the space of only a few seconds, a specific and immediate collective recognition that something genuinely different from ordinary comedic misstep had just occurred in front of them. Frank Sinatra stood up so fast that his chair toppled backward onto the stage floor. He did not wait for Carson to intervene, did not wait for the comedian to finish his routine, simply rose immediately and moved directly toward the other guest, his famous composure completely abandoned, replaced by a raw and unmistakable anger that several people present said they had never previously witnessed from him in any public setting across his entire extensive career. He said, his voice carrying an intensity that the boom microphones captured with complete clarity, that he had spent 20 years defending his friend against exactly this kind of casual cruelty, and that he was not willing to sit quietly and watch it happen on a stage he was sharing with him. He continued, his voice still carrying the raw and unguarded intensity that had defined his entire response, telling the comedian directly that talent and success had never once protected Sammy from exactly this kind of casual cruelty, and that he personally had watched his friend absorb this treatment, night after night, and city after city, with a grace and a dignity that Sinatra said he himself had never been required to demonstrate, given his own considerable privilege as a white performer who never once had to navigate the specific and exhausting indignities Davis faced simply attempting to build the same kind of career. Sammy Davis Jr., according to everyone present, sat frozen for a moment, his own composed public persona, developed across decades of navigating exactly this kind of casual cruelty with practiced grace, briefly overwhelmed by genuine emotion at watching his closest friend defend him so completely and so immediately in front of a national television audience. Several people present described the specific and remarkable quality of watching Davis's own famously composed public demeanor, a composure he had spent decades carefully cultivating specifically as a survival mechanism against exactly this kind of casual cruelty, finally, and completely dissolve in real time, evidence of exactly how significant it felt to him to watch someone else absorb the anger and the confrontation that he had, for the entirety of his career, been required to absorb entirely alone. The studio audience, 300 people who had come expecting an evening of warm entertainment reminiscence, sat in a silence that several people present described as the most complete and most genuinely charged silence they experienced at a live television taping. Several audience members, interviewed by entertainment reporters in the days following the broadcast, described the specific and unusual quality of this silence, distinct from the ordinary tension that occasionally accompanied other unscripted confrontations they had witnessed at similar tapings. One audience member specifically noted that the silence felt less like uncertainty about what might happen next, and more like collective recognition that something genuinely important was unfolding, a specific awareness that they were witnessing a moment considerably more significant than ordinary television entertainment. Johnny Carson, watching this unfold from behind his own desk, made an immediate decision to intervene directly, rather than allow the confrontation to escalate into something that might genuinely damage his program, or, more importantly, genuinely harm any of his guests. Carson's own instinct in this moment, according to production staff who witnessed it directly, revealed exactly why he had become the most trusted host in American television, a specific ability to recognize immediately when a situation required his direct and personal intervention, rather than simply allowing the broadcast's usual unscripted rhythm to continue unmanaged. Understanding that the genuine safety and genuine dignity of his guests mattered considerably more than any consideration of maintaining the broadcast's ordinary entertainment structure. He rose from his own chair and moved toward Sinatra, speaking quietly and firmly, acknowledging the genuine offense of what had just occurred, while also working to de-escalate a situation that had, within seconds, transformed from ordinary entertainment into something considerably more serious and considerably more consequential. What followed was not, in any conventional sense, entertainment. The comedian, understanding the genuine severity of what had just occurred, offered an immediate and visibly shaken apology, though several people present noted that this apology felt considerably less significant than what happened next, when Sinatra, his composure gradually returning, but his conviction entirely unchanged, turned to address the studio audience directly. He described, for the first time in any public setting, the specific and considerable effort he had spent nearly 2 decades quietly investing in protecting Sammy Davis Jr. from exactly this kind of treatment: confrontations with hotel management, insistence on equal accommodation, threats to cancel his own lucrative engagements whenever venues attempted to treat his friend as anything less than a full and equal colleague. Sammy Davis Jr., finding his own voice after several long moments, spoke with genuine and considerable emotion about exactly what Sinatra's loyalty had actually meant to him across 2 decades of navigating an industry and a country that frequently refused to treat him with the basic dignity his talent had clearly earned. He described the specific and cumulative psychological toll of constantly having to calculate, in every new city and every new venue, exactly how much dignity he might reasonably expect to receive, an exhausting and largely invisible labor that his white colleagues, including even his closest friends, rarely had to consider at all. He said that Sinatra's willingness to fight this battle alongside him, rather than simply expressing private sympathy from a position of considerable personal safety, had provided him with something he considered genuinely rare and genuinely precious throughout his entire career: the specific and profound relief of not having to fight every single battle entirely alone. He described specific incidents: hotels that had initially refused him accommodation until Sinatra personally intervened, restaurants that had attempted to seat him separately until Sinatra insisted on eating together or not at all. A pattern of quiet but absolutely consistent advocacy that Davis said had made an incalculable difference in his own ability to survive and eventually thrive within an industry that so frequently made survival considerably more difficult for him than for his white colleagues. He recounted one specific evening in considerable detail: a restaurant that had attempted to seat the 2 men at separate tables in different sections of the establishment, Sinatra immediately standing and informing the restaurant staff that both men would be leaving together unless they were seated together. A small but specific moment that Davis said he had thought about repeatedly across the following years. understanding that Sinatra could have easily accepted the separate seating without any personal cost to himself, and had instead chosen, in that ordinary and largely unremarkable moment, to make Davis's dignity his own immediate and non-negotiable priority. The studio audience, absorbing the full weight of this exchange, began to applaud, not the light, appreciative applause that had characterized the evening's earlier moments, but something considerably more sustained and considerably more genuinely moved. The sound of an audience honoring something they understood to be genuinely significant, rather than simply entertaining. What followed was a considerably longer and more genuinely candid conversation than either the audience or the production staff had anticipated. Sinatra and Davis discussing, with a directness neither had ever displayed so completely in any previous public appearance, the specific texture of what their friendship had actually required across 2 decades of navigating an industry and a country still working through the genuine and painful process of confronting its own deeply embedded racial prejudice. Sinatra spoke, in particular, about his own gradual education regarding the specific and daily texture of the discrimination Davis faced, describing his own initial and somewhat naive assumption, early in their friendship, that his own advocacy alone might be sufficient to shield Davis entirely from mistreatment, followed by his slower and more painful understanding that no amount of individual advocacy, however genuine and however consistent, could fully protect a black performer from a country whose discriminatory structures extended considerably beyond any single hotel or restaurant policy that Sinatra's own commercial leverage could directly influence. Carson listened throughout with genuine and evident respect, understanding, with the same instinct that had made him the most trusted interviewer in American television, that this particular conversation required considerably less active guidance than simply patient, attentive presence. NBC's switchboard, according to production staff who monitored it, received an overwhelming volume of calls in the days following the broadcast, viewers writing and calling specifically to express their genuine admiration for Sinatra's immediate and unhesitating defense of his friend, alongside considerable additional commentary about the broader and still deeply unresolved questions of racial equality that the broadcast had inadvertently but powerfully illuminated. Several of these callers specifically described their own experiences witnessing or experiencing racial discrimination, and a considerable number specifically praised the broadcast for demonstrating, in real and unscripted terms, exactly what genuine allyship actually required: immediate and visible action, rather than private sympathy expressed only in comfortable and low-risk settings. One caller, a black entertainer who had faced similar discrimination throughout his own career, told a production staff member that watching Sinatra's immediate and complete defense of Davis had given him a specific and renewed hope that genuine solidarity across racial lines was possible within an industry that had, for decades, offered him considerably more disappointment than genuine support from his white colleagues. This response, echoed across the substantial volume of calls and letters NBC received in the following weeks, suggested that what had happened on that stage had touched something considerably larger than the specific story of 2 beloved entertainers, a broader and genuinely significant moment in America's ongoing and still incomplete reckoning with its own deeply embedded racial prejudice. Several civil rights organizations specifically cited the broadcast in subsequent commentary as a genuinely significant example of a prominent white entertainer using his considerable platform and considerable commercial leverage to directly confront racial discrimination rather than simply expressing polite disapproval from a comfortable distance. Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. remained close friends for the remainder of their respective lives, their bond, already considerable before that broadcast, deepening further in its aftermath according to people who knew both men well. Several members of their shared circle noted that the specific and public nature of Sinatra's defense that evening seemed to shift something fundamental in how both men discussed their friendship in subsequent years, moving away from the more private and largely unpublicized advocacy that had characterized their earlier decades together toward a considerably more open and considerably more publicly acknowledged partnership. Davis, in several later interviews, specifically referenced that broadcast as the moment when America finally understood the actual depth and the actual substance of their friendship, rather than simply observing its glamorous and carefully managed public presentation through Rat Pack performances and film appearances. Sammy Davis Jr. died on May 16, 1990, and Frank Sinatra, at his funeral, gave a eulogy that specifically referenced their decades of friendship and specifically credited Davis with teaching him more about genuine grace under pressure than any other person he had known across his entire life. Sinatra's eulogy specifically referenced the 1965 Tonight Show broadcast, describing it as one of the moments he was proudest of across his entire life, not for any professional achievement it represented, but because it had finally allowed him to say publicly and completely what he had spent 2 decades demonstrating privately through action rather than words, that Sammy Davis Jr. deserved every ounce of the respect and the dignity that the country had so frequently and so painfully failed to extend to him. Frank Sinatra himself died on May 14, 1998, 8 years after his closest friend, and several of his own obituaries specifically cited his quiet but consistent advocacy on Davis's behalf as one of the more significant and more genuinely admirable aspects of his complicated and considerably documented public life. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood, something that connects the entire arc of Sinatra and Davis's remarkable friendship back to what happened on that Tonight Show stage. Years after both men had passed away, when historians and biographers began examining the full scope of their extraordinary partnership for various retrospective projects, several specifically identified this particular broadcast as one of the most significant and most genuinely revealing pieces of evidence available about the actual substance underlying one of American entertainment's most celebrated friendships. One historian, in a documentary examining the Rat Pack's considerable cultural legacy, noted that the broadcast offered rare and genuine insight into exactly what Sinatra's advocacy had actually required across 2 decades, evidence that even the most glamorous and seemingly effortless partnerships in American entertainment history sometimes concealed genuine and considerable courage that audiences, watching only the polished final performances, rarely had any opportunity to witness directly. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the people in your own life you might need to defend more visibly and more immediately, rather than continuing to offer only private support while remaining publicly silent when it actually matters most. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that genuine friendship sometimes requires standing up immediately and completely, without hesitation, regardless of the personal or professional cost that defense might carry. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the moments when friendship required genuine courage rather than simply comfortable loyalty. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and telling me about a time you stood up immediately for someone you loved or a time you wish you had.